Hello and welcome to DM It All, the show where we discuss D&D books and tabletop gaming history. In this episode, we'll be covering the history of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st Edition. Check out our video on original Dungeons & Dragons if you want to learn about the system that preceded AD&D, which we strongly recommend watching, as a good chunk of this video will be discussing what's been changed from the original game. Note that we're not going to be able to do a deep dive on every AD&D book like we did with the original system. Original D&D lasted for around 3 years, while AD&D 1st Edition thrived for over 10. Original D&D was financially successful but short-lived due to some unforeseen flaws. First of all, it was designed as a supplement for a war game that it had eclipsed in popularity. The original mechanics were also extremely simple, relying on a paltry 3 classes with mostly 6-sided dice. There were important changes and clarifications to the core rules that were scattered across different supplements and even newsletter articles. Original D&D in general did not explain its rule set very well, so it was played very differently from group to group. As D&D's publisher TSR wanted players to be able to transfer their characters to other tables and official D&D events, a more thorough rule set was required, delivered in a smarter, more condensed package. Thus, in 1977, TSR launched Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, as well as Basic Dungeons & Dragons. Basic D&D was meant as an introductory teaching tool for Advanced D&D, as it only went up to level 3. The system was aimed at younger players with the expectation that they would eventually graduate to AD&D. So naturally, AD&D targeted the older and more hardcore existing D&D fanbase. Gary Gygax, the co-creator of D&D and president of TSR, was the lead designer of the AD&D core set. D&D's other co-creator, Dave Arneson, was not involved with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons at all. He was actually no longer even with the company by the time AD&D was released. Arneson was briefly hired as an employee for TSR in 1976, but ended up leaving the company that very same year. Arneson and several of his colleagues were unsatisfied with their duties at TSR, and many felt their design work was being ignored. In fact, several employees left within the first few years of the company's existence. Arneson himself vacated TSR when they instituted a new employee agreement that was meant to bar employees from performing any freelance work outside the company. Even after Arneson left, he still received royalties from TSR due to his early contributions to original D&D. This amounted to 5% royalties off of the cover price for each D&D book sold. That was until the release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Gygax argued that Basic and AD&D were substantially different enough from the original game to qualify as new products. He therefore felt that Arneson did not deserve royalties for a game he had not worked on. Arneson took Gygax to court in 1979, and the case was settled 2 years later. Arneson ended up receiving 2.5% royalties off the AD&D cover prices going forward, which was the equivalent to the royalties that Gygax himself earned. D&D's co-creators never worked together again aside from a brief period in 1986, when Gygax hired Arneson to make some supplements based on his Blackmore setting. That deal ended up being short-lived due to Gygax leaving TSR for a whole mess load of reasons we'll dive into later. Instead of being packaged into a small box set, AD&D's core rules were published in 3 hardcover books with over 100 pages each. Frugal fans may be alarmed to learn that each of these books cost as much as the original D&D box set, but these were meant to be premium products, with more content and production value, in order to help the official D&D products stand out amongst the imitators. The core rules consisted of a monster manual, the player's handbook, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. But these books were not released simultaneously, instead coming out 1 year apart from one another. The first to hit the market in 1977, believe it or not, was the Monster Manual. It was initially used as a supplement for the original game, as the advanced rule set had yet to be finalized. The Monster Manual was also largely composed of creatures from original D&D, though this book compiles them across many sources, in addition to fleshing them out with much needed details. The Player's Handbook arrived next in 1978. Players would still have to combine this tome with the original rules for the Dungeon Master, but it at least provided the first step toward a fresh new system. Most of the rule changes were carried over from the optional rules during original D&D, with many of them first appearing within the Greyhawk supplement penned by Gygax himself. The original game, combined with Gygax's supplement, basically functioned as a beta test for AD&D. Other rules came from not only other supplements, but also specific rulings from the official TSR newsletters. While AD&D consolidated a lot of this material into one place, the Player's Handbook introduced a lot of new elements that would become staples for the franchise. For example, AD&D is the first appearance of the half-orc race, which gave players official access to monster-like protagonists. Gnomes were also added to the player pool. Whereas the original game included gnomes as monster NPCs, here they were promoted to player characters and made much more prominent throughout the game. Gnomes always had a hard time differentiating themselves from the other smaller races, as they were originally just skinnier dwarves. AD&D granted gnomes access to the rare illusionist class, giving them a reputation as cunning magical tricksters. AD&D marked the first appearance of many defining racial features, as this was the first edition to grant elves unique resistances to sleep and charm. This was also the first edition to give each race their iconic stat bonuses and penalties, such as the halfling's dexterity bonus and strength penalty. Stats in general only continue to become more important, and thankfully, the Player's Handbook was more flexible with stat generation. Character creation in the original game involved rolling 3 dice and assigning their sum to each stat in the exact order they were generated. AD&D instead gave the option for players to roll 4 dice and drop the worst result. Players could then assign the sum to whichever stat they preferred. Although plenty of people still wound up using the old method, rolling 4d6 would eventually take over as the standard for the franchise for quite some time. The Cleric, Fighter, Magic User, and Thief remain the core classes of D&D, with everything else demoted to a subclass falling under these 4 categories. The one exception to this is the Monk, which oddly found itself labeled as a core class. This might be due to the fact that the Monk didn't really fit under any of the existing classes, due to its wide array of unique abilities. In fact, it was such an outlier that there weren't even any subclasses listed under it. The Bard was also hard to pin down, which might explain why AD&D didn't place it with any of the other classes at all. The Bard was instead moved to the appendix section at the back of the book, along with the confusing and controversial psionics rules. While the Monk still largely functioned like the class from the original rule set, the Bard now utilized the dual class system. This is not to be confused with multiclassing, a concept that first appeared in original D&D. Multiclassing allowed non-human characters to level up as multiple classes simultaneously, splitting any experience gained between the different classes. Dual classing, on the other hand, was usable only by human characters. Dual class characters essentially switch classes after a certain point, retaining some of the benefits of the old class. In order to become a bard, a character had to dual class as a fighter, thief, and druid to represent the bard's jack-of-all-trades nature. The initiative system in AD&D was similar to that of the original game, focused on team initiative over individual initiative. Team members would declare their actions and then resolve them, based on the speed of the act they were performing or the weapons they were using. Extra attacks, haste, and other factors could allow a character to act during the opposing team's turn, but the general structure was very much team-focused. Combat remained broken up into rounds like in modern D&D, but these rounds were further split into specialized segments. So the team that won initiative will go together in an earlier segment, with their opposition following after them in a segment of their own. There were 10 segments in total, with all the extra segments reserved for special cases such as surprise and spell casting. Additionally, a lot of the stronger spells would take multiple segments to cast, so enemies could often move before spells had finished casting. If the spellcaster took any damage before the spell was complete, the attack would ruin their concentration and cancel the spell. These changes were made to purposefully weaken spellcasters. High-level magic users retained their superiority over high-level fighters, but now they needed a tanky party member to prevent their spell from fizzling out. High-level fighters also gained access to followers to compensate for this magic melee power disparity. Most of the AD&D classes gained NPC followers, as it was assumed that player groups would transition from adventuring to large-scale wargaming at higher levels. Fighters formed their own armies, thieves and assassins ran their own guilds, and clerics built fortified monasteries. Likewise, monks and rangers also gained their own small group of devoted followers. The concept of followers was eventually phased out of later editions to keep the focus on individual characters, but followers were an important part of class balance in AD&D. Fighters could not cast broken high-level spells, but they could enact a world-shaking campaign with their armies. Spellcasting actually received further nerfs through stricter requirements. Spells now required specific hand motions, vocal sounds, and/or materials in order to activate. Not only did this prevent spellcasting if a mage was bound and gagged, but magic users were significantly easier to notice and shut down amidst the chaos of combat. There were also new penalties for using certain spells, as the most powerful effects could artificially age the caster or recipient. If that wasn't bad enough, magical aging had a chance to trigger a system shock check. System shock represents the physical trauma caused by magical effects, such as petrification or polymorph. If a character botched this check, their mind would fail to handle the transformation, which could outright kill a character from mental anguish. The chance for survival was based on a character's constitution, which also determined their chance of being resurrected successfully. A character's maximum constitution score also determined the maximum amount of resurrections that were even possible for said character. These rules made AD&D one of the few additions to really make death a constant looming threat, regardless of the party's preparations. In 1979, the Dungeon Master's Guide completed the release of AD&D's core rule set, although it was meant for a lone pair of eyes, the Dungeon Masters. A lot of the rules are a continuation from what was written in the player's handbook, but many sections come across as errata, meant to directly address reactions to the first rulebook. The best example of this is the section on thief skills, as it features many clarifications on the thief's capabilities. Not only does this entire section feel like it should have been in the player's handbook, it reads like Gygax is directly responding to players abusing the rules. The Dungeon Master's Guide also covers a wide variety of contingencies, including the likelihood of contracting diseases, the impairing effects of alcohol, and the time needed to create a siege weapon. One of the most infamously involved aspects of AD&D are the weapon and armor rules. Different weapons had different speeds, a certain amount of space needed for wielding, and varying effectiveness against different armor types. These were not relevant in every conflict, given that both sides need to be equipped with armor or weapons. Weapon speeds in particular were usually used to break ties in initiative between two armed opponents. This is also the first edition to feature rules for grappling and knockdowns, though they function very differently in this incarnation. Using these rules mostly involved calculating a bunch of percentages based on equipment, stats, and even height and weight differences. One of the most well-known concepts from this book is the idea of potion miscibility. Characters in D&D quaff potions for a variety of reasons, from mending wounds to buffing for an upcoming fight. But in AD&D, these liquids can mix together in the stomach to create some crazy results, like making the effect permanent, turning it into poison, or even causing a massive explosion centered on the drinker's gut. Another infamous idea from this edition was the concept of character training. Nowadays, characters simply level up once they acquire a certain amount of experience, but in AD&D, characters had to pay for training, which required weeks of tutelage and exercise. The training length could be shortened, but only if the player roleplays the character appropriately. Rules like this are why AD&D adventures took place over years of game time, rather than a handful of weeks. Patience is also required for AD&D's laboriously long crafting system. Players could create their own magic items, potions, and even custom spells. These activities took weeks to accomplish, and even then could result in failure. AD&D was wary of players abusing its rules, so it left its crafting system vague and inefficient. It was mainly an activity to occupy the magic user's time, while the fighter was busy managing their kingdom. This vagueness extends over to AD&D's profession system, as professions couldn't really be used to craft anything of value. These professions were called secondary skills, and they functioned more like background information. There were instances where professions became relevant, but it was largely to identify quality materials, rather than crafting anything of importance. We should also mention that this book is the first explanation of the modern D&D alignment system. The original game had Law and Chaos work as a catch-all to represent good and evil, but AD&D finally separated them into distinct classifications. A character could now be lawful evil or chaotic good. A lawful character believes the group is more important than the individual, while a chaotic character values the opposite. Good and evil, on the other hand, determines whether a character favors human rights or selfish purpose. Creatures of a similar alignment had a secret alignment language they could use to communicate in limited ways. This was meant to imitate how the Catholic Church used Latin as a common language for its clergy, but alignment languages didn't really have a unified organization. The concept is a bit weird and unintuitive, so it never really caught on past the early days of D&D. The first supplement for AD&D was Deities and Demigods, released in 1980. While it further detailed various D&D gods, it primarily focused on figures from real mythologies. It also added fictional deities outside of D&D, including creatures from the Cthulhu mythos, as well as the works of Michael Moorcock. TSR ended up removing the chapters featuring these deities in subsequent revisions of this book. This was because a different company, called Chaosium Incorporated, started publishing the Call of Cthulhu and Stormbringer RPGs during the early 1980s. In 1984, TSR renamed Deities and Demigods to Legends and Lore, due to a growing controversy at the time, one that began with an unfortunate real-life event at Michigan State University. In 1979, a student by the name of James Dallas Egbert went missing in the steam tunnels beneath the college grounds. Details soon arose that the boy had mentioned an obscure game called Dungeons & Dragons to one of his friends. Nothing D&D related was found in Egbert's room, but campus police believed he had drawn out a dungeon map using thumbtacks. They argued that the map represented real locations at the university. The theory became that the boy entered the steam tunnels in order to act out his D&D fantasies in real life. William Deere, a private detective hired by Egbert's parents, discussed this speculation with the media, and the story quickly spread across America. Although the boy was eventually found and his disappearance had nothing to do with D&D, the full details of the case were initially kept secret, allowing the unwarranted D&D paranoia to thrive even longer. In 1981, a novel called Mazes and Monsters was published that bore some striking similarities to the Egbert incident. It portrayed a young college student spiraling into obsession with an RPG similar to D&D. The student eventually developed psychological issues as he began confusing his fantasy world with real life. A TV movie for Mazes and Monsters was released a year later, starring Tom Hanks in his first leading role. Several other works of cautionary fiction about role-playing games began sprouting up like dandelions around this time as well. The media frenzy connected D&D to other incidents where troubled youths were acting out in dangerous ways. Patricia Pulling was the mother of one such youth, and after her son's passing, she became the face of the D&D opposition. Pulling created an organization called BAD, an acronym that stood for Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. This organization handed out booklets that tried to connect D&D to Satanism and witchcraft. To newer viewers of this channel, this was no joke. There really was a firm belief that D&D players were participants in occult behavior. As D&D was still an obscure and misunderstood hobby at the time, it was frequently painted as secretive, deviant, and cult-like. This resulted in several religious groups arguing that D&D was a literal method to indoctrinate young people into satanic organizations. The controversies caused TSR to transition away from the darker imagery of its early years in order to cultivate a more family-friendly aesthetic. But as the saying goes, any press is good press, since the controversy massively boosted D&D's sales and expanded its name recognition. These events not only introduced mainstream America to role-playing games, but made D&D synonymous with the genre, making it the first thing many thought of when they heard the letters RPG. The next major supplement after Deities and Demigods was the Fiend Folio in 1981. This was a compilation of monsters that appeared in White Dwarf, a UK gaming magazine. White Dwarf was published by the Games Workshop, the owners of the Warhammer franchise. The Games Workshop was given the UK license for D&D until TSR opened their own UK branch. The Fiend Folio was essentially a sequel to the Monster Manual, but with a lot more creators actively involved. Many of the monsters were even created by various readers of the White Dwarf magazine. Though this book features a lot more obscure monsters than those found in the Monster Manual, there are still many noteworthy ones such as the Undead Death Knight and the Psionic Githyanki. TSR would go on to publish a second monster manual 2 years later, with most of its bestiary borrowed from various adventure modules. And speaking of modules, AD&D marked the beginning of the franchise's most famous adventures, starting with their first official adventure, 1978's Setting of the Hill Giant Chief. This was the first entry of the Against the Giants series, where each foray saw the party invading a different tribe of bloodthirsty giants. This series and many of the other early D&D modules were written by Gary Gygax, so he set most of them in his own personal Greyhawk setting. By 1984, TSR wanted a more collaborative setting structured around one central plotline rather than numerous independent narratives. The final result was Dragonlance, a series that revolved around various D&D dragons in an epic plot comparable to Lord of the Rings. The concept for the series came from Tracy and Laura Hickman, the husband and wife duo behind the original Ravenloft adventure. Dragonlance was released not only as a series of D&D adventures, but also novels that covered a similar series of events. At the time, it was D&D's biggest multimedia project, greatly expanding D&D's foothold into the fantasy genre. On top of countless D&D modules, TSR also released new material in their official magazine, Dragon. It began publication in 1976 at the tail end of original D&D, and would eventually outlive TSR itself. This magazine featured plenty of TSR news, promotions, rule clarifications, and advice for D&D players, as well as optional classes, monsters, spells, items, and rules that players could experiment with. In addition to this, Dragon also spotlighted fantasy fiction stories and discussed prominent works of fantasy during a time where there weren't many communities focused on the genre. Some famous D&D writers actually got their start by submitting articles to Dragon magazine. For example, this is where Ed Greenwood first premiered his Forgotten Realms setting to the general public. Dragon magazine material was usually less balanced than the content within official D&D books, as it naturally didn't undergo the same level of rigorous playtesting. Not that it stopped TSR from compiling a lot of this imbalanced material into a 1985 book titled Unearthed Arcana. It's here where many players first encountered the weapon specialization rules, an evolution of the weapon proficiency system from the player's handbook. In original D&D, players could wield any weapon related to their class, but AD&D forced them to choose armaments from their class list to focus on. Using a weapon they weren't proficient in would result in attack penalties. Weapon specialization took this one step further, allowing standard fighters to focus on a single weapon type. Doing so granted both attack bonuses and extra attacks, turning the tanky fighter into a much deadlier class. For spellcasters, Unearthed Arcana introduced minor spells known as cantrips, which is likely a familiar term for modern players. Cantrips function differently in this edition, however, generating very minor effects for level 0 magic users. For example, instead of being able to lob firebolts or eldritch blasts, magic users back then would cast spells to clean dishes or change an object's color. And yes, there was a level 0 in AD&D. It was usually reserved for ordinary NPCs not strong enough to qualify as a major D&D class. Unearthed Arcana also premiered 3 new classes: the Cavalier, the Barbarian, and the Thief Acrobat. The first of these, the Cavalier, was essentially another take on the Paladin. Although the Cavalier received no holy powers from a divine being, it had a similar chivalric knight concept. On top of an even stricter code of honor, Cavaliers needed to be sponsored by a lord, meaning the player usually had to be from a higher social stratum. In exchange, they received attack bonuses, parrying bonuses, and unique mounted abilities. They were also the first D&D class able to increase their stat points as they leveled up. While the Cavalier never graduated to a core D&D class, it still had a significant impact on the Paladin's development. Unearthed Arcana altered the Paladin from a fighter subclass into a Cavalier subclass, granting them many of the Cavalier's abilities, including bonuses to saving throws and a class-defining immunity to fear. The Barbarian, on the other hand, would be later promoted to a core class. However, the Unearthed Arcana Barbarian lacked a rage mechanic, as it was based more on versatile pulp heroes like Conan the Barbarian. These barbarians had access to around 12 different nature-based skills, ironically making them better survivalists than the AD&D Ranger. And even without a rage mechanic, these barbarians still had a nasty, destructive temper. Barbarians hated magic to the point that they were compelled to destroy any magic items in their vicinity, and they refused to associate with spellcasters. These restrictions were gradually lifted as the character leveled up, but, as you could guess, they made the barbarian unappealing as a potential party member. The third class, the Thief Acrobat, was unlike its peers in that it was made too weak rather than too strong. Unearthed Arcana's Thief Acrobat was an option for mid-level thieves that wanted to focus less on lockpicking and more on physical stunts. The Thief was already one of the weakest D&D classes, so it, along with its acrobatic counterpart, would later be folded into the broader and much more dangerous Rogue class. 1985 saw the arrival of the Oriental Adventures rulebook, aimed at players interested in an Eastern setting for their role-playing adventures. This book acts as an alternative to the player's handbook, with a wide variety of Eastern-flavored classes and races, to replace the more Tolkien-esque elements within AD&D. It also added more weapon specialization rules, and was the first appearance of non-weapon proficiencies in an official D&D book. Non-weapon proficiencies were basically an evolution of the secondary skills from the Dungeon Master's Guide, except they were more fleshed out and provided detailed rules for numerous mundane activities outside of combat. Unbeknownst to players, both Oriental Adventures and Unearthed Arcana were partially intended as the testing grounds for 2nd edition AD&D. That is, 2nd edition according to Gary Gygax. Yet unbeknownst to Gygax, he would soon lose control of TSR and exit the company before 2nd edition ever began production. Strap in, because the series of events leading to this are lengthy, daisy-chaining all the way back to the company's formation. A lot of this information comes from the 2021 book Game Wizards by John Peterson, which is currently the best source documentation of TSR's history. When Gygax started TSR in 1973, he did so with his childhood friend Don K. The original TSR logo was actually a K and G to represent its two founders, and K was the one that suggested forming a new company to publish Dungeons & Dragons. But Gygax and K lacked the funds to do so. Enter fellow wargaming enthusiast Brian Bloom, who offered to cover the remaining production for Gygax, at the cost of Bloom acquiring an equal stake in the company. Sadly and unexpectedly, Don K would pass away from a heart attack in 1975 at the age of 36, with his share of the company transferring to his widow. So Bloom convinced his father, the owner of a tool and die company, to buy out K's share. Since Brian Bloom's brother Kevin had been hired by TSR as the company's treasurer, Kevin ended up buying out his father's shares, those which once belonged to K, in 1981, and took on more administrative responsibilities. In 1983, TSR underwent a restructuring in order to deal with its debt, as the company's growth was slowing. Kevin Bloom was promoted to the president of TSR, while Gygax became the head of the company's media branch, which made sense as Gygax was the biggest RPG celebrity by this point, acting as the face of D&D in TV interviews. Thus, Gygax began visiting Hollywood, California, to pursue film and TV opportunities for the franchise. This was around the time when the D&D cartoon was developed in collaboration with Marvel Comics. Also around this time, Gygax met screenwriter Flint Dille, who worked on the G.I. Joe and Transformers cartoons. Gygax and Dille collaborated on a Choose Your Own Adventure line of books, as well as an unproduced D&D movie script. By 1984, TSR's financial problems had only worsened, which consequently led to Kevin Bloom being ousted as the company president. The Blooms still had majority shares in the company, but TSR's creditors wanted drastic changes in order to restore their confidence. So TSR's board of directors began searching for a potential buyer for the company. Gygax, however, did not want to sell TSR to an outsider. He was a gaming enthusiast at heart, wary of people that only had a financial interest in the company. So Gygax increased his shares to become the new majority shareholder, prompting the board of directors to pick him as the new company president, with the hopes that he would make TSR solvent again. Gygax told his Hollywood friend Flint Dille that he was still looking for new investors, so Dille introduced Gygax to his sister, Lorraine Williams. Williams and her brother were both the inheritors of the Buck Rogers franchise, as the original comics had been published by their grandfather's newspaper company. Therefore, Williams had solid business experience, as well as a lot of funds from maintaining the Buck Rogers IP. Gygax hired Williams into an administrative position so she could handle a lot of the day-to-day management. She dealt with TSR's creditors and eventually made the company profitable again. Around this time, the Bloom brothers wanted to leave TSR, so they offered their share of the company up for sale. Gygax supposedly expressed interest in buying out their shares, but he didn't act on the sale right away. This may have been a negotiating tactic, as the company was suffering $3.8 million in losses by 1985, and Gygax appeared to be the only person interested in buying more shares. What he didn't expect, however, was Lorraine Williams making a deal with the Blooms behind his back. It turned out that Williams wanted to become a partial owner of the company in order to enact more significant changes. So with the Blooms having sold their shares to Williams, she was now the new majority shareholder. Not only that, but the board of directors favored this deal, as they were actively feuding with Gygax regarding the copyright to Greyhawk and all his published material. So the board of directors took the opportunity to enshrine Williams as the new president of TSR. Gygax tried to cancel the deal so that he could buy out the Blooms instead, but it was too late for them to back out of their agreement. With Williams in charge and the board behind her, Gygax felt the company had been taken over by exactly the type of financially driven outsiders he was trying to avoid. Thus, he sold his remaining shares in 1986 and left the company that he had once helped create. AD&D First Edition continued until 1989, but the departure of Gary Gygax spiritually marked the end of an era. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in general feels like a direct improvement over the original, in no small part due to a more complete rule set. Some readers might feel understandably overwhelmed by the amount of material here, which was why D&D Basic was developed alongside it as a more laid-back introduction to the series. But we'd argue AD&D is still worth a look, as it is a gargantuan attempt by Gygax at fixing the original game. Original D&D is far from the most balanced rule set, which works both for and against it. The overpowered spells and wondrous items gave players something to look forward to, letting them play out epic tales of heroism. But certain, shall we say, creative players took it too far, sapping the Dungeon Master's campaign of any sort of challenge. It probably didn't help that D&D evolved out of the wargaming hobby, where many of its players weren't trying to participate in a shared story as much as quote-unquote win the game. AD&D tries to address a lot of the egregious cheese strategies by introducing believable complications and challenges that might arise. Spellcasting remains incredibly powerful, but is now a balanced mixture of risk and reward. Characters no longer just level up out of nowhere, but have to seek out trainers that take weeks to learn from. Thought has to be put into one's housing situation, as living in shabby conditions could lead to contracting diseases. Some might view these as needless complications, but these consequences fleshed out the game world, requiring more thought for what were once simple interactions. At the very least, AD&D houses a great toolset for dungeon masters who want to preserve the danger and mystery within their game worlds. Despite his tyrannical feats as a DM, Gary Gygax did not insist that players need to use every single rule within these books. He instead wanted dungeon masters to understand the different rules and the reasons they had been put in place. The Dungeon Master could then use the rule if they felt it was necessary, or disregard it if it didn't fit their campaign. Random encounters, for example, were meant to prevent players from going to sleep in the dungeon after every single fight. If the party was instead moving swiftly and strategically through the dungeon, the DM could eschew with the random encounters altogether. While modern D&D editions are written more like technical manuals, AD&D is written to be more conversational, almost as a stream of consciousness. Gygax loves his complex and flowery words, and is not afraid to expound on his thought process behind his design. This is referred to as Gygaxian prose, and it gives classic D&D a unique charm, for better or worse. The downside to Gygax's colorful voice is that it can make the text difficult to decipher. Many rules were universally ignored just for being too complicated to use in a real game. Very few people actually use the complete initiative system, due to the amount of weird edge cases and exceptions that could alter a character's initiative. Other rules were ignored because it was just too easy to miss them. For example, characters in combat actually couldn't move and act in the same turn unless the enemy was within a 10-foot radius of them. This rule is only mentioned once in the Dungeon Master's Guide, right before the section detailing charge attacks. The Dungeon Master's Guide also states that fighters give their opponents a chance to retaliate when using their extra attacks. Missing rules like this can lead to wildly different games, often producing more mobile characters with greater burst damage. It doesn't help that the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide tries to clarify and expand upon material that's also present in the player's handbook, It's nice to have further clarification, but less nice to have to refer back and forth between the books to fully understand the rules. Modern editions generally try to compartmentalize their concepts better, so that it's easier to get a sense of which rules belong in which book. We do recommend buying and reading AD&D, but we don't really recommend it as a reference book, especially not for your players, unless everyone at the table is super invested in a hardcore, authentic 80s RPG experience. Instead, we recommend to accompany AD&D with a retro clone that streamlines its intricate rules. It's useful to know why Gygax introduced a rule, but it's arguably more useful to have it easy to reference. The retro clone we suggest is the one that sticks closest to AD&D's rules, Osric, the old school reference and index compilation. While not everything is fully accurate, we suspect most old school groups probably played a homebrew version of the AD&D rule set anyway. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons did a lot to improve on the original game's inconsistencies, but it was meant to be more of a guidebook than a textbook. It may be a complicated system to learn at first, but it can generate some interesting predicaments that your gaming group won't soon forget.